So we bring in Ali Howorth. So, dude, congratulations on a heck of a WAFCON that you've got to cover so far, man. It's been fun.
Yeah, I think that there's no better way of putting it than just saying it's the greatest tournament we've ever seen from the Women's Africa Cup of Nations. We've seen unprecedented upsets. We've seen new teams rising to the top. We've seen old teams crumbling. We've seen teams qualifying for the World Cup. The lowest ranked team ever to qualify for the World Cup in Malawi. It's just been storyline after storyline. And, this came off the back of expanding the tournament. There's more NWSL players in the tournament than ever before, more, big name players from Europe. It's just growing. It's bigger and better, and we love it.
Yeah, and the fact that you went through all of that stuff and we've gotten here to the semifinals, is Malawi the biggest story of the tournament, or is there something in a greater scale that's a greater story? Is Malawi the number one story here?
I think it's a coin flip between Malawi and Nigeria, because while Malawi's unprecedented kind of performance has been phenomenal, for every kind of yin, there's a yang, and that's Nigeria having their worst ever performance. Now, you might say worst ever performance, they got to the quarterfinals. Nigeria have never been knocked out in the quarterfinals in the Women's Africa Cup of Nations. They've won it 10 times out of 13. And of those other 3 times, they made it to the semifinals. So this was equally huge. But then, you look on the flip side, Malawi qualifying for the World Cup. The last team that qualified for the World Cup that was the lowest ranked team ever was at the last Women's World Cup, 2023. Zambia qualified. I think they were 77th ranked in the world when they qualified. Malawi are 153rd. They have blown every kind of record out of the water. They have only participated in 5 Women's Africa Cup of Nations. And by participated, I don't mean made it to the tournament. I meant tried to qualify. So this is their debut. So there's been 13 Women's Africa Cup of Nations since the first in 1998. Malawi women's football, the national team didn't even play its first game until 2002 and have spent more time not existing since then than they have existing. And so for them to do this, to beat Nigeria, to beat Ghana, to make it to the semifinals, to qualify for the Women's World Cup, because in African qualifying, if you get to the semifinals of the Women's Africa Cup of Nations, you qualify for the World Cup. It doubles as that. It's a truly remarkable story, to be honest. It's incredible.
And for those that may not know, the hook here in this country, it is the Shawinga sisters. It is Temwa Shawinga, who is ridiculous, and I mean that in the most complimentary way possible, lighting up the NWSL, and her sister Tabitha. And it's been really cool to see that, that family dynamic be a part of this. And I'm a guy that loves the underdog. Give me the underdog. No, I'm not going to sit there and go juice box on it, but give me an underdog. Give me a great story like this. And the Shawinga sisters, I guess, have been the personification of this run that these underdogs and these no names in quotation marks, these unexpected Final Four participants, that's like the personification of this whole thing.
Yeah, 100%. And look, it's just, for some of us who've been kind of following the Chawinga sisters for a long time now, back when they're, playing Malawi, playing in the Kasafa Cup, which is like the Southern African tournament, going through to Europe, going to China, going back to Europe, or in Temwa's case, to Kansas City, we've been crying out to see these two play at this tournament. And as I was talking about, the country didn't even participate in qualifiers. At the last WAFCON, they didn't even try and qualify. They said, look, we don't have enough money. We can't pay our players. We can't fund this. So to finally see 2 superstars, because, I often talk about how in the women's game in Africa, a little bit of investment goes a long way, unlike the men's. The men's, it's so oversaturated. You got to put on a lot of money to get your value. In the women's, you see a country that is one of the poorest on the continent, that has some of the least infrastructure. They invest just a little bit, just enough to give these 2 players a chance. Because I think what's beautiful about their story is it's simultaneously the brilliance of those 2. But on top of that, it's the legacy of the Malawians who've been putting in the work. So I've got to take you back to the 1990s, when women's football didn't even exist in Malawi. And essentially in 1995, a woman's player called Maggie Chombo Sadiki, who's actually the assistant coach of the current team. She essentially had to start a team with her uncle, the first women's team in Malawi. They didn't even have enough women to make a whole team. So there was like 4 boys in the team, in the first all-women's team, because there weren't enough women. There weren't enough girls to play. And then that was in Blantyre, the southern city of Malawi. And in the Lilongwe, the capital, a couple years later, a guy called David Dube started his own team called Didi Sunshine. And it was his team that pulled Temwa and Tabitha from the north, because Temwa and Tabitha, you got to understand, they grew up in Rumpi, in the middle of nowhere, in a village in the north of Malawi, super far from any kind of economic centers, any cities. And so it's his work where he started this academy. He brought both of them to his team. Tabitha then goes to Sweden. Temwa then first goes to this other team that Maggie started down in Blantyre, and then into Sweden. And again, for the first one, this Swedish team didn't want to buy Tabitha. They said, we don't want to buy this Malawian player. So this guy David Dubé said, fine, I'll pay the tickets, I'll pay for the flights, I'll pay for the accommodation, and if she's good enough and you sign her, you reimburse me. Of course, that's what ended up happening. A couple of years later, Tabitha tells her team in Sweden, hey, I've got this sister, she's even better than me. And they say, no, there's no way. There's no way. We don't trust you. And she said the same thing. She said, I'll pay for her flights. I'll pay for her accommodation. I'll pay for everything. If you sign her, you reimburse me. And that's what happened. And now these two are being superstars, and they're going to be superstars next year at the World Cup.
No doubt. It's great to catch up with our friend Ali Howorth here and find out what's going on in WAFCON, Women's Africa Cup of Nations. If I had told you before the tournament started that this Final Four would be this Final Four, what would you have told me?
I would have told you you're crazy. I would have told you needed to lay off the drink or the smoke or whatever it is you're on, because this is completely unprecedented, right? You know, we've got Morocco, Cameroon, Algeria, and Malawi. Malawi, as we talked about, debutants. Algeria, they had not made it past the group stage until last tournament. So this is the first time. That was the first time they made it out of the group stage, got knocked out of the quarterfinals. The idea of them reaching the World Cup, reaching the semifinals, is again insane, because the amount of progress they've made in the last 3 years is just remarkable. And then Cameroon is an amazing redemption story, because they used to be the one team that competed with Nigeria. Nigeria, as I mentioned, 10 of 13 WAFCONs, completely dominated women's football on the continent. They had a huge head start ahead of all the other countries. Women's football in that country dates back to like the 1940s, 50s, 60s. They obviously were part of that first ever Women's World Cup, and they kind of benefited a huge amount from being there. Cameroon were the one team that competed with them. And by competed, I mean they were the ones that always lost to them in the final. That's what I mean by competed. But Cameroon fell off. They didn't even qualify for this tournament. And I would explain that is that this tournament expanded from 12 teams to 16 teams for the first time ever. But they expanded it after the qualifiers were already done. So they said, oh, wait, we need to bring in 4 teams. So they brought in the 4 highest ranked teams, which is Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Egypt, and I'm forgetting the last one. But Algeria were the ones who actually knocked Cameroon out of qualification. So Cameroon didn't even qualify for this tournament, and they're somehow in the semifinals. So the only one of those 4 teams that you would say, yes, I'm not surprised, they should be in the semifinal, is Morocco. They're the only ones. The other 3, it's ridiculous how they got here.
The established names that are not in the semifinals, and compared to those that are, is it because of, and I'm trying to, are the margins closing, or was this just events where those up and coming teams caught the established teams on a bad day? Are the margins closing on the continent?
I think it's both. Absolutely. For instance, Nigeria getting knocked out by Cameroon, that game, that was probably Nigeria's actually best game. They played really well. They were probably a little hard done by. Cameroon scored an absolute wonder goal. Their goalkeeper had the, best performance of any player at the tournament in a single game. So, that's Nigeria getting, they actually didn't deserve to lose that game. But absolutely, you would say Nigeria have, and this is for me a big theme of this tournament, is the chickens coming home to roost. Nigeria, I remember interviewing their previous head coach, Randy Waldrum, a guy from the U.S. who coached in Pittsburgh.
Yep.
And he, the one who took them to the World Cup, who took them, beat host Australia, took them out of the group, almost beat England in that amazing penalty shootout when England got the better of Nigeria. And he said he's spoken a lot in the last couple of years about how we stopped investing in women's football in Nigeria. And when he spoke to me, he said he hadn't been paid in 14 months.
Yeah,
which is just a good example. And he actually said, not to me, but to someone else in a different podcast, he said, look, if Nigeria goes on this path, there will come a day where they don't qualify for the World Cup. Now, I'm not sure if he thought that day would be the next World Cup, but that's come around. And suddenly Nigeria, they're not quite out. They've got to play a playoff, but they're in very, very murky water. And so I think it's the same with South Africa. I remember interviewing their head coach, Desiree Ellis, after they won the WAFCON for the first time in 2022. An amazing night, brilliant game. And she was saying, this has got to be the starting point. This has got to be the launch point. This has got to be where we start to really invest in women's football. We can catch the European teams. She firmly believed that. I firmly believe that. And sadly, the federation just has not put in the money. They've not given them the support. Women's football in South Africa has gone backwards in the last 3 or 4 years, despite a really good showing at the World Cup. They got out of the group stage for the first time ever in 2023. Whereas you look at Morocco, you look at Malawi. Malawi's investing money, not much because it's a poor country. They can't compete with South Africa and Nigeria in terms of the amount of money. And yet they're doing better because they are investing that money. And Morocco are the best example. Morocco put more money into their women's football as a proportion of their GDP more than any country in the world. They invest so much into their women's game, and they're seeing the benefits of it.
When you look at investment, and you mentioned how the higher ranked teams, and the higher, and I mean like number itself, not to the top, but I'm thinking like, the Malawi ranking, the higher number. When it comes to investment, I mean, do you have any idea what we're talking about? Because you have these poor nations that are investing, and you're seeing the results of that investment. But I mean, what kind of capital are we talking about here? Is it and how are they getting this capital if they're so poor?
We're really not talking much. So the players for the Malawi team, for their winning bonuses, they originally are set at 500,000 Malawi kwacha. And this tournament, they've quadrupled that to 2 million. So they said, we're going to pay you 2 million Malawi kwacha if you win, for every game you win. That's about $1,100. Wow. So it's not a lot of money. In Malawian terms, it is, because Malawi has, it's a very poor country. Where they've gotten that capital is a lot of it has come from the bank, and a lot of credit from Malawi has to go to their president, a guy called Fleetwood Haya, who came into power in 2023 and said, look, we're going to start investing in women's football. We don't have a lot, but we're going to invest. And in 2023, slightly before he became president, they won the CASAFA Cup, which is like a tournament for countries from the southern part of Africa. They launched their first ever national league. So they didn't have a national league up until last year. They did not launch that. And a lot of that came off the back of getting investment from the Malawian Bank, the National Bank of Malawi, the NBM. So you're really not talking about a lot of money. I remember speaking to an owner of a club in Morocco, and he was saying it's in the realms of like, in a Moroccan terms, just a couple $1,000s to start a women's football team in Morocco. Now, Morocco is very unique because the state heavily subsidizes teams. In fact, in Morocco, the state actually pays every single club. They pay the wages of every single player and the coaching staff and a medical doctor. They give you like a baseline, kind of like a universal basic income. And they say any money you make on top, you can pay them more if you want. So the richer teams can pay more, but every single team makes, and I think it's about three. So if you're a player in Morocco, if you're in the top division, your baseline salary, no matter where you are, is $300 a month. That's slightly above minimum wage in Morocco. And so that means that if you're starting a women's club in Morocco with just a couple $1,000s, you're getting investment from the state where they're saying, we'll give you access to training pitches. We'll give you access to stadiums. Yes, it's not yours, it's the state's. Yeah. And so all you're doing is topping up whatever they're already paying in. So in Morocco, it's not that much because the state invests a lot, but it really varies from country to country. But when you kind of compare it to the amount of money you need to invest in the men's games in terms of developing elite academy infrastructure and all of this to compete with Europe, compete with South America, it's chump change. And I think where you've seen a lot of success is the countries that have put in, and the institutions that have put in, even a fraction of the work into their women's game as they have with the men's. So a good example is the Right to Dream Academy in Ghana. It is the kind of new elite, top of the line academy in Ghana and West Africa. Mohamed Kudus came through there, the kind of Tottenham star. Ernest Nuama, Caleb Vierinci, who just signed for Coventry City, had an amazing World Cup with Ghana. But two of the superstars of this tournament are Ivorians, a girl called Grace Ruth Seri, their central midfielder, and Insira Ouedraogo, who up until their quarterfinal, when she actually got a controversial red card, she, for me, was the best player of this tournament. Better than Temwa Chawinga, better than Tabitha Chawinga, better than everyone. They're both 18, and they've both just moved to Denmark, where they're playing for FC Nordjylland, which is the club that Right to Dream owns. So Right to Dream have invested just a fraction of what they invest in the men's game into their women's game, and they're already producing stars in just a couple of years. Same with the Egyptian women's national team. The Right to Dream have an academy there. I think it's like 6 of the players in the Egyptian women's national team came through the Right to Dream. So it's really not a lot in terms of what you want to invest. And this is what I always say. I want to someday bump into Michelle Kang, the owner of Lyon and whatever, Washington Spirit, all the clubs she owns, and say, just give me a couple million and we'll be giving you Tabitha Chawingas throughout. Because when I speak to people from Malawi, that's all they say. They say, we've got so many players. We got so much talent. We got players. I remember speaking to one guy who's a club owner there, and he said, we've in my club alone, we've got 2 or 3 Temwa and Tabitha Chewingas just waiting for a chance. And look, he might be exaggerating, but it goes to show that the talent is there. What we need is the investment, the pathways, the kind of ways for these players to go. And you got to remember, Temwa and Tabitha was the first player in Malawi to ever leave the continent to play. No other player had ever gone to Europe or gone to China or gone to the US or gone anywhere. So, for Malawi, it is hopefully just the start of something special.
Yep, and I know a team that's based here in our headquarters city that starts in 2028 that might be looking down that road if they need to. And you doing all this advanced scouting, we do appreciate that because we want them coming out of the blocks. Tony Economopoulos from Mercer coming up in about 5 minutes. And you realize, of course, that you opening all these doors means that after the final, you're going to have to come back and we're going to have to talk about more of this stuff. One of the things that has struck me disappointingly is attendance. Why is that?
So attendance has not been great at this tournament. I would say for the main reason is, one, fans don't travel on the continent of Africa. It's very, very rare to see fans traveling. In the men's game as well, it's very rare to see an AFCON where games that don't involve countries that are neighbors having big stadiums attendance. It's just not the reality. Now, the last 2 have been exceptions. The first being in Cote d'Ivoire. That's because Cote d'Ivoire is at the heart of Francophone Africa. There's a lot of visa-free travel between countries around it, and a lot of West African Francophone nations qualified for Cote d'Ivoire for that tournament. Morocco is kind of the opposite. It's Morocco's proximity to Europe. There's big diasporas. Suddenly, there are a lot of people can travel. With the women's game, I think there's in the African football, it's so hard to travel. I mean, just a good example of South Africa. If you want to be a South African traveling to Morocco to support your team, you're paying close to $2,000.
Wow.
You're flying through Qatar or Turkey, or maybe both, or maybe even Turkey, Paris, Morocco. And so there's the kind of realities of the logistics of the African continent that come into play. I think the second big factor is Moroccans are a little tired of this competition. Look, Morocco has hosted this tournament. This is their 3rd time hosting it. They hosted it in 2022. They hosted it in 2024. They're hosting it now in 2026. And I think a lot of Moroccans are kind of really tired. I'll take you back to 2022 when Morocco qualified for the semifinal. First time they'd ever qualified for the World Cup. First time they ever got out of the group stage. They're playing Nigeria. In the Moulay Abdallah Stadium, the old one that I was at, 53,000 is the capacity. I guarantee you there's about 70,000 fans in that stadium. I reckon another 20,000 just trying to get in. Same with the final. I had a friend who arrived 3 hours before kickoff. He missed the first half because he couldn't get in. A journalist, so he's going through the media entrance. He's not got a fan ticket. That's how popular it was. But I think there's just a lot of fatigue. They've hosted the men's AFCON. They've hosted other tournaments. They've seen their women's team get to the final twice. So I think there's just not as much interest in the tournament as a whole from Moroccans, which obviously is where you're going to pull the most of your fans. And actually, in Morocco, we tend to see the best fan bases coming from those who have diasporas living in Morocco. So Malawi, we've seen a few hundred, Malawians attending their games, and that's because Malawi and Morocco have an agreement where some Malawians can go there for higher education. Same with Senegal, same with Zambia, same with a few other countries. But I think that's the reality. I think it's just the realities of the African continent and the realities of a tournament that is kind of, the hosts are a bit tired of it. They don't really want it anymore, to be honest.
Semifinals, Malawi, Algeria, and Casablanca, after Morocco and Cameroon are in Rabat. Hit the promo for me because I know how to see what you're doing. Let everybody else know so they can see as well and get really smart when it comes to everything going on the African continent.
Yes, I host my own YouTube show called Ali's African Football. I just started it. So we're growing, and they're done a lot on the women's AFCON, doing stuff on all the games and telling stories, as well as on my Substack, where, again, I try to do a bit more in detail stuff. Same name, Ali's African Football. That's where you'll hear a lot of the same stuff I was just talking about the Malawian team, a bit more history. I'll give you a teaser about how the reason that Malawi women's football started was in large part thanks to a condom company in the 1990s, which is a bit of a fun twist. So if you want to read about that, head over to my Substack, Ali's African Football.
Wow. Okay, that's a tease. So after the final, will you come back and we'll keep talking about all this stuff and let folks in the NWSL and the USL Super League get to recruiting from everything that you're laying out, my friend?
Absolutely. And look, if they want to pay me a fee to do some agency work to get these players over to the US, I'm more than happy. Tap me up. I'm more than happy to help and be a scout for any NWSL or USL team.
Got it, my friend. It's always great to see you. Glad you had some time to yourself and recovered and got out of the sick bed because you got semifinals tomorrow. It's always great to see you and catch up.
Thanks so much.
There he goes, Ali Howorth. And yeah, the anything on the African continent, he knows what's going on. That's why with WAFCON going on and all the chaos, we figured we'd catch up with Ali and find out what's up there. But yes, the WAFCON, the other reason that we're kind of talking about it is because of that right there. That team right there coming in 28. Keep an eye on WAFCON, and you get to see some talent come down the pike. And when you have people are talking to Ali about, there are 3 or 4 more Temwa and Tabitha Shawingas that are out there. We know what Temwa has done in Kansas City. So let's see what they can do when it comes to what's going on. Where is it? There it is. What's going on with NWSL Atlanta 2028. Just saying.